She slammed the contract onto his desk, her voice trembling with fury. 3 years, Alexander. 3 years of silence, and now I find out I was nothing more than a business deal. Tears burned down her cheeks as he stood frozen, the mighty billionaire CEO stripped of all his power in front of the one woman who mattered most. For the first time, Julian Ashford, the man who controlled empires, was powerless. Powerless against the truth. Powerless against her pain. And in that moment, Sophie wasn't just a wife forgotten in the shadows. She was a storm breaking free, demanding to be seen. The clock in the Grand Anderson residence struck 6 in the morning. The mansion was alive with quiet movements, maids polishing crystal, a gardener already trimming roses outside. But inside the kitchen, silence reigned. Sophie Wilson, 24 years old, sat alone at the marble counter, spooning cereal into her mouth as quickly as she could. Every morning felt like a ritual of invisibility. She ate at 6, then vanished upstairs before her husband, Julian Ashford, the billionaire CEO of Ashford Global, descended for his perfectly timed breakfast at 6:15. 3 years. 3 endless years of marriage without love, without warmth, without even a single affectionate touch. Sophie sometimes wondered if she was married to a human or to the ghost of a contract. Their union had never been about love. Her father's failing construction business had been drowning in debt, and the Ashford family, with their empire of hotels and global investments, had stepped in with a deal that benefited both sides. Sophie became Mrs. Ashford at 21, her signature inked on marriage papers that felt more like a business merger than a vow. In 3 years, Julian had spoken fewer than 50 words to her, words that sounded like instructions, not conversations. And in 3 years, Sophie had learned to survive by becoming invisible. But that morning, everything changed. She heard footsteps, firm, sharp, deliberate. Her heart jumped. Too early. He never came down before 6:15. Sophie's instinct was to rise and leave, but before she could reach the door, his voice cut through the air. Sophie. Her name, spoken in that deep, commanding tone, froze her. It was the first time in months he had addressed her directly. She turned slowly. There he was, Julian Ashford, in a tailored charcoal suit, blue tie knotted perfectly, every inch of him radiating power, his steel-gray eyes locked onto her like searchlights. "Yes," she whispered, trying not to betray her surprise. "Do you have something suitable to wear to a corporate gala?" His voice was flat, almost mechanical, like he was asking an assistant. Sophie blinked. "I don't understand. It's a simple question. Tomorrow evening, 7 o'clock, I need my wife to accompany me." Her chest tightened. In 3 years, he had never once taken her anywhere in public. She had always been the hidden shadow in his life, unseen and unacknowledged. "Why now?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "For business reasons," he replied coldly. "International investors are attending. I need to appear as a stable family man." The words sliced her like glass. She clenched her fists beneath the table. "And if I don't want to go?" His brows lifted in faint surprise. "That's not an option, Sophie. It's your duty." "Duty," she repeated, the word bitter on her tongue. "Like everything else in my life, isn't it?" For the first time, a flicker passed across his face, something like regret quickly masked. He moved closer. "This event is important. Contracts worth billions are at stake. You will need to look presentable." Sophie raised her chin defiantly. "Presentable? You don't even know who I am, Alexander. You don't know my favorite color, or what I studied, or how I spend my days in this prison of a house while you ignore me." He said nothing. His silence was more damning than words. "That's what I thought," she whispered. Then, with dignity, she stood and brushed past him. "I'll go to your event, Mr. Ashford, but not because it's my duty. Because after 3 years of being invisible, I want to see the world you chose over me." She left him standing alone in the kitchen. And for the first time in 3 years, Julian Ashford actually watched his wife walk away, noticed the grace in her posture, the quiet strength in her eyes. Something stirred in his chest, a sensation he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Upstairs, Sophie sat on the edge of her bed, heart pounding. Tomorrow night, for the first time, she would step into the spotlight as Mrs. Ashford. But was she ready for what that meant? Downstairs, Julian remained rooted to the marble floor, his gaze fixed on the empty doorway. Why did her defiance cut through his armor so deeply? Why did the thought of her standing beside him, truly beside him, suddenly matter more than the billion-dollar deals he lived for? He didn't have the answer. Not yet. But tomorrow night would change everything. The following evening arrived faster than Sophie expected. She had spent most of the day pacing her room, staring at the mirror, unsure of who she was anymore. A wife, a prisoner, a stranger in her own home. For 3 years, she had never stepped out as Mrs. Ashford. No reporters had ever seen her. No photographs ever circulated. She was a rumor, a whisper in the corporate world that Julian Ashford was, in fact, married. And tonight, she would no longer be invisible. At 6:30 sharp, a knock sounded at her door. Mrs. Lane, the elderly housekeeper, entered with a garment bag draped over her arm. "This came from the master's personal stylist, Mrs." Lane said softly, avoiding Sophie's eyes as if ashamed to be part of the arrangement. Sophie unzipped the bag and froze. Inside was a gown, silken midnight blue, sleek but elegant, the kind of dress that demanded attention. For a moment, she hesitated. Did Julian choose this, or was it just another transaction, an image to polish his reputation? Either way, she slipped into the dress. When she caught her reflection, her breath hitched. For years, she had been hidden beneath plain clothes, tied-back hair, muted colors. But now she looked like someone she barely recognized. Someone powerful. At exactly 7:00, Julian was waiting in the foyer. Tall, broad-shouldered, flawless in his tailored black tuxedo, he looked every bit the billionaire CEO. But when he saw her descending the staircase, something flickered in his eyes. For once, Julian Ashford did not look like a man in control. Sophie's hand brushed the rail as she walked down with quiet grace. Every step echoed, filling the silence. His gaze never left her, not even for a second. "You look presentable," he said finally, his voice low. Her lips curved in a small, bitter smile. "I'll take that as a compliment, Mr. Ashford." He offered his arm stiffly. She hesitated, then placed her hand on it. Their first touch in years. And though it lasted only seconds, it sent a shiver through both of them. The Ashford limousine glided up to the city's grandest hotel, where chandeliers glowed through glass windows and a red carpet stretched out like a golden path. Photographers clustered near the entrance, their cameras flashing. The moment Julian stepped out, flashes exploded. But when Sophie followed, the world seemed to pause. Gasps rippled through the crowd. "Who is she?" "That's his wife. She's stunning." Sophie held her chin high, though inside her heart pounded. Inside the ballroom, music played softly. Champagne glasses clinked. Politicians, investors, and socialites turned as Julian and Sophie entered arm in arm. For the first time, she wasn't invisible. And Alexander, Julian looked at her as if realizing that fact too late. It wasn't long before a tall, charming man approached. His smile was easy, his presence confident. "Julian Ashford," he said, extending a hand. "Always a pleasure, and this must be the mysterious wife we've all heard nothing about." "Richard Thompson," Julian introduced stiffly. "Emily," he caught himself. "Sophie, my wife." Richard took Sophie's hand gently, holding it just a moment longer than polite. "Sophie, it's an honor. I must say, Alexander, you've been hiding her far too well. She's extraordinary." Sophie felt heat rise in her cheeks. She wasn't used to compliments, not after years of being overlooked. Alexander's jaw tightened. His arm around Sophie grew firmer. Something sharp and unfamiliar coiled inside him. Jealousy, Later that evening, Julian pulled her aside. His voice was tight, his eyes stormy. "You enjoyed that, didn't you?" Sophie blinked. "Enjoyed what?" "Thompson," he spat. "The way he looked at you, the way you smiled at him." Sophie lifted her chin. "I smiled because, for once, someone actually acknowledged me as more than a piece of paper. Is that so wrong?" His silence cut deeper than any words. "For 3 years you never cared whether I smiled or not, and now, suddenly, it matters." She pressed. His eyes darkened. "It matters more than you know." For a fleeting second, vulnerability crossed his face, but before she could decipher it, he turned away, the walls back up. The limousine ride was thick with silence. Sophie stared out the window at the glittering city lights, her thoughts spinning. She had walked into the gala expecting humiliation. Instead, she had walked out with a strange, burning question. Why did Alexander's jealousy feel more intimate than his silence ever had? He sat across from her, his hand clenched into a fist, his gaze fixed on the passing streets. But every few seconds, his eyes flicked toward her reflection in the glass. For the first time, he wasn't seeing a stranger. He was seeing his wife, and it unsettled him. Back home, Sophie entered her room, shutting the door softly behind her. She leaned against it, her breath shallow. Her reflection in the mirror stared back at her, the woman who had turned heads tonight, who had made her husband's carefully controlled world tremble. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of power, not because of the dress, not because of the gala, but because she had realized something. She was no longer willing to be invisible. Tomorrow, she decided, she would no longer live like a ghost in her own life. Downstairs, Julian poured himself a glass of scotch, his hand unsteady. He replayed every moment of the evening, Sophie walking down the stairs, Sophie smiling at Richard, Sophie standing with her chin high. The image unsettled him, gnawed at him. He had built his empire on logic, discipline, strategy. But tonight, all of that was crumbling because of one woman, his wife. Why did he suddenly care? Why did the thought of losing her make his chest tighten like a vise? For the first time in 3 years, Julian Ashford realized he was no longer in control. The night of the gala had ended, but its echoes lingered in the Ashford mansion. Sophie lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying every detail. The stares, the whispers, the way Richard Thompson had looked at her as though she was someone worth noticing. And the way Julian had reacted, sharp, possessive, almost human for once. For 3 years, she had longed for any sign that she existed in her husband's world. Tonight, she had seen it. But instead of relief, she felt only confusion. Why now? The next morning, sunlight streamed into the vast dining room where Julian always had his breakfast at precisely 6:15. For 3 years, it had been the same omelet, black coffee, newspaper, a ritual no one dared disturb, but this morning was different. Sophie entered, her steps hesitant but firm. She usually avoided him at this hour, disappearing into the shadows. Not today. Julian looked up, startled. For a fraction of a second, his eyes softened, almost as if he was glad to see her. "You're early," he said, folding his newspaper. "And you're predictable," she replied, sliding into a chair across from him, his brow furrowed. "What does that mean?" "It means," she said evenly, "for 3 years I've known your routines better than I've known your heart. Every morning you sit here, silent as though I don't exist. Last night you proved otherwise." The room went still. The only sound was the faint clink of cutlery as a maid set down her plate. Julian cleared his throat. "I may have reacted poorly at the gala." Sophie tilted her head. "Poorly? You nearly crushed my arm in front of half the city's investors because another man dared to compliment me." His jaw tightened. "He was looking at you like..." He stopped himself. "Like what?" She pressed. His eyes locked on hers, and for once he didn't look away. "Like you belonged to him." Her breath caught. She leaned forward, voice steady. "And do I belong to you, Alexander? Because for 3 years I've been nothing more than a name on a marriage license to you." Silence stretched between them. His eyes flickered with something raw, unguarded. Finally, he whispered, "I don't know how to do this." She blinked. "Do what?" "Be a husband," he admitted, his voice rough. "I never learned. I was taught business, power, survival, but never this." The honesty in his tone startled her. For years, he had been stone, untouchable. Now, cracks were showing. "You're right," Sophie said softly. "You don't know, because if you did, you would have seen me long before last night. You would have seen the woman sitting across from you at this very table every morning hoping for just one word." He looked down at his untouched coffee. "And yet you stayed." "Because I made vows," she replied bitterly, "even if you never honored them." Her words hit him harder than she expected. For once, Julian Ashford didn't have a counterargument, no sharp retort, only silence. A few moments later, he stood abruptly. "Stay here." Confused, Sophie watched as he disappeared into the kitchen. When he returned, he was holding a plate, pancakes, still warm with a drizzle of honey. He set it in front of her awkwardly, almost shyly. "What is this?" she asked, startled. "Breakfast," he muttered. "You usually leave before you eat. You shouldn't." Sophie stared at the plate, then at him. "Alexander, you've never served me anything before." He shifted uncomfortably, rubbing the back of his neck. "Consider it a first." Her lips parted in disbelief. It was such a small gesture, yet after 3 years of emptiness, it felt monumental. She picked up her fork, her hands trembling. "Thank you," she murmured. His gaze softened. "How did you sleep?" She froze mid-bite. Slowly, she set the fork down. "Excuse me." "I asked how you slept," he repeated, almost sheepish. Her heart twisted. Such a simple question, but it was the first time he had ever asked it. "Like a stranger in my own house," she said quietly, meeting his eyes. His jaw tightened again, but this time not in anger, in shame. That afternoon, Sophie found herself walking through the city for the first time in months. Without Alexander's watchful eyes, she felt free, lighter. She stopped by a small cafe, ordering tea, when a familiar voice startled her. "Mrs. Ashford." She turned to see Richard Thompson, charming as ever, smiling warmly. "Richard," she greeted, her guard rising. "Forgive me for intruding," he said, pulling out a chair. "But I wanted to say you were magnificent last night. The entire room was stunned. You have a presence that even Julian couldn't hide forever." She flushed, both flattered and unsettled. "I'm not sure about that." "I am," Richard insisted, lowering his voice. "You're wasted in that mansion. You deserve to shine." Before she could respond, a shadow fell over the table. Alexander. His expression was stormy, his presence like a thundercloud. "Richard," he said tightly, "enjoying yourself?" Richard leaned back unbothered. "Just complimenting your wife. She deserves to hear it." Alexander's eyes burned into Sophie. "She doesn't need your compliments. She has me." Her breath caught. He had never claimed her like that before. Richard raised a brow, smirking. "Does she?" The tension between the two men crackled like lightning. Sophie's heart pounded. For once, she wasn't invisible. She was the center of a storm she had never asked for. That evening, back at the mansion, she confronted him. "You had no right to barge in like that," she snapped. His voice was low, raw. "He was looking at you like you were his. And you think you can stop that by glaring at him?" She shot back. "You ignored me for 3 years, Alexander, and now suddenly you want to act like I matter." He stepped closer, his eyes intense. "You do matter. More than I understand. More than I should." Her chest tightened at the confession. For a heartbeat, she saw him, not the CEO, not the untouchable billionaire, but the man beneath. And for the first time, she felt both fear and hope, because if he truly meant it, everything could change. The days after the cafe confrontation were different. The Ashford mansion, once an icy prison, began to breathe with subtle shifts. For the first time in 3 years, Julian didn't eat breakfast alone. Some mornings, Sophie joined him at the long mahogany table. At first it was awkward, two strangers trying to pretend they weren't, but slowly, cracks of humanity slipped through. He would ask her simple questions. "How was your sleep? Do you like coffee or tea? Are you still reading those history books?" Ordinary questions to anyone else. but to Sophie they were extraordinary because they came from him. One evening, she found him in his office, not buried in contracts or phone calls, but waiting. A plate of food sat untouched on his desk. "You haven't eaten," she said softly. "I was waiting for you," he replied simply. The words froze her in place. She sat down hesitantly, and for the first time they shared dinner. No lawyers, no board members, no housekeepers hovering, just them. He listened when she spoke. He even laughed, an unfamiliar, startling sound, and against her will, a fragile hope began to bloom in her chest. Could this be real? Could the man who had ignored her for years truly be trying? A week later, Julian surprised her again. "I want you to come with me," he said one morning. "To where?" "South America. We're launching a new hotel line in Santiago. You studied international markets, didn't you? I could use your expertise." She blinked, stunned. "You want me to work with you?" "Yes," he said firmly. "Not just as my wife, as my partner." Her heart raced. For years, she had buried her degree, her ambitions, her mind. To hear him recognize it now, it felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. But part of her hesitated. Could she trust this change? Or was it just another performance, another image to maintain? That evening, while organizing documents in his office, Sophie noticed a leather folder wedged behind the desk. Curious, she pulled it free. At first, it seemed like ordinary financial papers, but then her eyes caught a phrase that made her blood run cold. "Marriage agreement, Ashford and Wilson families." Her hands trembled as she flipped the pages. Clauses, cold, calculated clauses. The marriage would secure a controlling interest in Wilson Construction. Sophie was to remain in the Ashford household, maintaining appearances. A stipulation about children, at least one heir within 5 years. Her vision blurred. She read the words again, each line slicing her deeper. This was never just about saving her father's company. It was a transaction. She was a clause, a bargaining chip. Her entire marriage had been inked on paper long before Julian ever looked at her. When Julian returned later that night, he found her standing in his office, the folder clutched in her hands. Her eyes were blazing, her knuckles white. "What is this?" she demanded. He froze. His gaze dropped to the folder. A muscle in his jaw ticked. "Sophie, don't Sophie me, did you know that our marriage was nothing more than a business deal?" He stepped forward cautiously. "Yes, there was an arrangement, but it was before." "Before what? Before you decided I might be worth noticing." Her voice cracked with fury. "For 3 years I thought maybe you were just cold, just incapable of love. But this means you never saw me as anything at all." His face paled. "It wasn't like that. It was exactly like that." She shouted, shoving the folder against his chest. "You sold me. My family sold me. And you signed the papers as if I were a property acquisition." He flinched as though her words were knives. "I didn't know all the details at first," he said hoarsely. "Yes, there was an agreement, but I didn't realize how cruelly it was written. I thought it was just a merger. I was a fool." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "A fool? No, Alexander, you were a coward. You had 3 years to tell me the truth. 3 years to see me as a person, but you hid behind contracts and silence." He reached for her arm, desperate. "Sophie, please, it's different now. I see you now. I want you." She jerked away as though his touch burned. "Want me? Or want to keep me from walking away now that you finally realize I might be valuable to you?" Her words hung heavy between them. His chest heaved, his carefully built armor shattering under her gaze. For once, Julian Ashford, the man who ruled boardrooms and bent billion-dollar deals to his will, was powerless. "I can't do this," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I can't live in a marriage that was built on lies." She turned toward the door, her steps trembling but determined. Alexander's voice broke behind her. "Sophie, don't go." She stopped, her back to him. For a long, silent moment, she stood there, shaking. Then she whispered, "You've had 3 years to make me stay, and you failed." And with that, she walked out. He sank into his chair, burying his face in his hands. For the first time in his life, he felt true fear, not of losing money, power, or status, but of losing the one person who had started to mean everything. The folder lay on the desk, its pages spread like a cruel mirror of his sins, and he realized that no amount of wealth, no number of contracts could undo the damage, unless he was willing to sacrifice everything. The hotel room was silent except for the hum of the air conditioner. Sophie sat on the edge of the bed, her suitcase still open, clothes spilling out. It had been a week since she walked out of the Ashford mansion, and she hadn't looked back. But her reflection in the mirror told a different story. Her skin was pale, her body restless, and for days she had felt the strange weight inside her, the suspicion she hadn't dared voice aloud. That morning, trembling, she held the test in her hand. The little blue line stared back at her, undeniable. Sophie Wilson Ashford was pregnant. Her knees gave out and she sank to the floor, covering her mouth as tears poured down her face. A baby, the child of a man she loved and hated in equal measure. The child of a marriage born in betrayal. Her phone buzzed. A message. "Alexander, I need to see you, please." She stared at the screen, her heart pounding. For a week, she had ignored his calls, his texts, the chauffeur waiting outside her hotel every night. But this message was different. Short, desperate. She typed back with shaking fingers, "I need to talk to you, it's important." His reply came within seconds, "Our home, 1 hour." Her chest tightened, home. The word felt foreign, fragile, but also inevitable. She packed the test into her purse, zipped her suitcase, and whispered to herself, "This ends tonight." The Ashford mansion loomed before her like a memory she wanted to erase. When the butler opened the door, she almost turned back. But then Julian appeared at the top of the stairs. He looked different, less polished, more human. His tie was loose, his eyes red-rimmed as though he hadn't slept in days. "Sophie," he breathed, descending the stairs. Her voice trembled. "We need to talk." "I know," he said quickly, "but please let me go first." He led her into his office. On the desk lay a stack of documents, signed and sealed. "I gave it all back," he said, his voice raw. She frowned. "What do you mean?" "The money, the investments, the entire deal tied to our marriage, $15 million, it's gone, returned, every cent." Her eyes widened. "You what?" "I wanted you to know," he said firmly, stepping closer, "that none of this has anything to do with business anymore. You're worth more than any deal, Sophie. You're worth everything." Her heart twisted painfully. "You'd throw away $15 million just like that?" "Yes," he whispered, "because without you, it's worthless." Tears stung her eyes. She had longed for these words, but fear still gripped her. "How do I know you're not just desperate because I left? How do I know this isn't another performance?" His shoulders sagged. For the first time, the indestructible Julian Ashford looked fragile. "Because this is the only way I know how to fight for you. I was blind, Sophie, and if it costs me my fortune to prove I finally see you, then so be it." Her hands trembled as she reached into her purse and pulled out the small test. She placed it on the desk between them. Julian froze. His eyes dropped, then widened as realization struck. "Is this?" His voice broke. She nodded, tears spilling. "I'm pregnant." The room spun with silence. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Alexander's hand reached across the desk, trembling, covering hers. "A child," he whispered. His eyes glistened. "Our child." Sophie choked back a sob. "I don't know if I can raise a baby in a house built on lies." "No," he said quickly, gripping her hand tighter. "Not lies, not anymore. I swear to you I will never let our child feel the emptiness you felt. I'll be the man I should have been from the start." Her lips quivered. "And what if I can't believe you?" "Then let me prove it every day until you do," he said, voice shaking with sincerity. For 3 years, their marriage had been void of touch. But now, Julian stepped around the desk and pulled her into his arms. At first, she stiffened. Then slowly, painfully, she let herself lean into him. His embrace was trembling, uncertain, but real. "I love you," he whispered against her hair. Not because of duty, not because of a contract, but because you're the only person who has ever seen me as more than a CEO. You taught me love isn't a weakness, it's strength, and I swear to fight for you, for us, for our child. Sophie's sobs broke free, years of pain unraveling in that single moment. For the first time in their marriage, she felt held, truly held. That night, she didn't unpack her suitcase. She didn't promise forgiveness, but she stayed. Not because of his wealth, not because of his desperate words, but because deep down, in the hollow corners of her heart, she wanted to believe. Believe that people could change. Believe that a broken marriage could heal. Believe that a child could grow up in a home filled with love, not contracts. And as she drifted into uneasy sleep beside him for the first time, Sophie realized something. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of the hardest fight of her life. The following weeks were unlike anything Sophie had ever known. The mansion, once a museum of silence, began to breathe with life. For the first time, Julian didn't bury himself in contracts until midnight. He appeared at breakfast not only with his usual black coffee, but with an extra cup, prepared just the way Sophie liked it, with cream and a touch of honey. For the first time, he asked, not ordered, the staff to keep the mornings quiet so she could rest. And for the first time, Sophie felt the faint pulse of a real marriage, but the shadows of the past still lingered. Every smile, every gentle gesture was haunted by the question, was it enough? Could love really grow from the ashes of betrayal? One evening, Julian invited Sophie into the drawing room. His parents were there, Mr. and Mrs. Ashford, the architects of the marriage contract. Sophie stiffened. Julian stood tall, his hand gently brushing Sophie's. "Mother, father, we need to talk." His father frowned. "Alexander, this is not the time." "It is exactly the time," Julian cut in, his voice sharp but steady. "For years, I let you dictate how I should live. You arranged my marriage like a business deal, and I went along, blind, thinking it was just strategy. But I won't let Sophie or our child live under those terms." His mother's eyes widened. "Child?" "Yes," Julian said firmly. "We're expecting, and I will raise this baby in love, not contracts." His father's jaw tightened. "You're throwing away everything for sentiment." "No," Julian replied, his gaze unwavering. "I'm finally choosing something worth more than money. I'm choosing my family." For the first time in years, silence fell not because of coldness, but because Julian Ashford had broken free. Later that night, in the quiet of their bedroom, Sophie looked at him carefully. "You stood up to them." "I should have done it years ago," he admitted. "But I was too afraid of losing control, too afraid of failing their expectations." She studied him, her eyes softer now. "And what about failing mine?" His chest rose and fell heavily. "I already did, and I'll spend the rest of my life making it right." For the first time, she allowed herself to believe him. Weeks later, under the sprawling oak tree in the Ashford estate gardens, Julian surprised her again. A small gathering of close friends, staff, and family was present. There was no red carpet, no press, just sincerity. He stood before her, holding her hands. "3 years ago, I married you out of convenience. I failed you in every way a husband can fail a wife. But today, I marry you again because I can't imagine a life without you. You are my heart, my strength, and the mother of our child. You've taught me that love is not weakness, it's the strongest force I've ever known." Sophie's tears streamed freely. She answered with a trembling smile. 3 years ago, I was invisible. Today, I stand as your wife, not because of paper or duty, but because I love you. You've shown me that even broken things can be mended, that people can change, and that second chances are real. I promise to love you and our child for as long as I breathe. The guests clapped as they sealed the vows with a kiss, not rushed, not cold, but tender, reverent, full of promises finally kept. Months passed. Sophie began her consulting work again, this time with Alexander's full support. She no longer lived in the shadows of his empire. She stood beside him, her mind and her voice valued. The mansion transformed into a home. Laughter returned to its halls, and as her belly grew, so did their love. One quiet evening, as they sat by the fireplace, Julian whispered, "Do you ever regret staying?" Sophie rested her head against his shoulder, her hand on her growing stomach. "No, because leaving would have been easy, but staying gave us a chance to build something real." His arms tightened around her, his eyes closing in relief. For once, he allowed himself to rest, not as a CEO, not as a billionaire, but as a man who had finally found love. When their child was born months later, a little girl with Sophie's eyes and Alexander's stubborn jaw, the past felt like a distant storm. Their marriage, once a cold contract, had been rewritten into a story of redemption, healing, and true love. For the first time, Sophie believed in forever. And for the first time, Julian knew what it meant to truly live, because love, fragile and flawed, had given them both a second chance. I've learned that sometimes the loudest transformation happens in silence. No one announces when your heart begins to heal, when you stop shrinking yourself to fit someone else's shadow, when you finally realize you were never invisible. They just never looked properly. I used to think power was about having control. Now I believe the real power is in seeing someone who's been overlooked and choosing to honor them. So ask yourself, who around you have you passed by without truly seeing? And maybe more importantly, when was the last time you fully saw yourself? Because dignity isn't something someone gives you. It's something you reclaim, quietly, day by day, decision by decision. If this story sparked something in you, I want to hear it. What did you feel? What did it remind you of? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one. And if you found this story meaningful and want to help us share these important values, please subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next inspiring story. Together, we can build a strong community full of potential and a spirit of justice. Because stories like this aren't just fiction. They're mirrors, reminding us what it means to be human.